significantly different from the Cayman Islands National Gallery? And indeed, based on your long experience, what does that term national really mean in terms of Caribbean galleries and museums, especially for our diverse and diasporic communities?
Thank you, Alessandra. And first of all, I want to say how delighted I am to be here. 26 years ago, I think, I was here for the launch of the National Art Gallery Committee and was also on a panel at that time. So it's really amazing to be back on this occasion. At that time, I was associated with the National Gallery of Jamaica, where I spent most of my career. Now I am the head of the Cayman Islands National Museum, which is a general museum. So I have made this transition from a National Art Gallery to a general museum with a remit that is very similar to the Barbados Museum. And by the way, we're also located in a heritage structure, so we have a lot in common. The Cayman Islands National Museum opened its doors in 1990, and it is located in a heritage building on the waterfront in Georgetown. It's actually the oldest standing public building in the Cayman Islands. It's a small building, it's a small museum as such at the present time, but with a huge collection of about 12,000 objects, all sorts of things, memorabilia, archaeological finds, natural history specimens, and also a collection of art. Right? And we predate the National Gallery, so the museum started collecting before there was a National Gallery, so that created a different kind of relationship. And the museum also collected art most actively at a moment when certain things were happening in Caymanian art. The Visual Arts Society was very active at that time. And then there was the McCoy Prize, which was this annual prize, which was a collaboration with the early National Gallery, actually, from which a lot of works were acquired. So there was this sort of idea of a developmental role. But the museum has a much earlier history, actually, in a private collection, in the private collection work of Ira Thompson. And Ira Thompson was a really interesting character. He was a taxi driver, sort of self-styled tour guide, a bird watcher, and all sorts of things. And he collected anything related to Cayman. I mean, from old glasses to passports, to found objects, to natural history specimens, and so on. And he opened this private museum, the Caymanas Museum, in 1959, and ran that for many years as a popular attraction, actually, in Cayman. And then eventually, in 1979, that collection was bought in its entirety by the government of the Cayman Islands. And that became the foundation of the Cayman Islands National Museum. So there is an earlier history there in private collecting, and sort of this absolutely amazing sort of cabinet of curiosities that this man put together. Now, Maya already spoke about the complexities of Caymanian identity, and those complexities have deep historical roots, and because almost every family in the Cayman Islands has connections somewhere, whether it is in Jamaica, in Cuba, in Central America, of course also Europe, and so on. So it has always been a very interconnected society with a strong maritime culture, so also the travel that comes with that has also played a role. But then in the last decades, I mean, basically from the 1960s and 70s onwards, the Cayman Islands also became an offshore banking center. And because of that, came in a very large expatriate workforce, which actually exceeds the local population at the present time, right? And that has created a lot of dialogue and if we're honest, also tensions around national identity. So this sense of a loss, you know, this sense that Caymanian identity is being lost in the process. And the museum is sort of positioned in a very interesting way in that context, because it's definitely seen as a sort of guardian of Caymanian identity, but it also needs to be open to all, and it needs to be receptive to social and cultural change. So it's sort of torn between those two poles, and that is actually also a political issue in the Cayman Islands. So it's a very, and it was an issue, for instance, in the recent in the elections in May. So it's very interesting to be in that context. In terms of our art collection, we have continued collecting from time to time after the National Gallery opened, but not as actively as before. But we have a collaborative relationship with the National Gallery, so we work very closely together actually, so we're not competing with each other at all. And I think for me as an art historian, by training, one of the interesting things is, first of all, I have to force myself not to focus too much on art, so I have to be careful with that to give due attention to everything. But it also allows, working from a general museum allows you to ask different questions. For instance, we're working on an exhibition called The Sea is History, taking our cues from Derek Walcott's famous poem. And that has a collection of objects that came from the sea, that were found on beaches, sometimes by Ira Thompson, that were found by others, objects that were part of maritime archaeological research and so on, and then also images and objects that talk about the sea as a bearer of memory and so on. So one of the nice things about being in a general museum is that you can have a vintage diving helmet in the same exhibition as an abstract painting, right? So you can really mix it up in a way that does not force you to stay within the realms of art. And that, I think, is perhaps what we can do a little bit different from the National Gallery, right?
Thank you. I very much appreciate the way in which you've introduced very different trajectories of development for each of your institutions. I want to, however, put to you the point that when we talk about art, we really need to be in the context of our institutions talking about visuality. And if we use that term, then we understand that people in visiting museums or art galleries their relationship with the object is based first and foremost on what they see, and therefore how they respond to that. Now, I want to look a little bit at the role of space and architecture and how important it is to have a permanent space for a national gallery or museum in the Caribbean. And does it give credibility and permanence, or does it risk alienating audiences by seeming elitist? Because we've had both responses in a number of different scenarios. And then, to what extent should national galleries be repository of collections versus active sites of engagement, education, and dialogue? And here, Maya, I'm looking at you to start us off in this context.
Yeah. I almost feel like the two will never be mutually exclusive. No. I think, when you do have a physical museum building, there is a very long legacy of what galleries and museums are and how they function in society. So I think there will always be a perception of them as potentially, places of importance, and also places that potentially limit, are seen as elitist, right? So there may be a certain section of communities that feel uncomfortable in those spaces, potentially for very valid reasons, right? I think our role as national institutions is about accessibility. And I think that comes in some of your questions. A national collection should be for the people of its community, right? So they need to have access to that collection. And I think having a physical space hopefully allows that, right? Of course, it doesn't just end at having a physical space. It also, then you need to make it even more accessible. So that could be, for us at the National Gallery, we're very lucky to have free admission, which is a huge barrier that we're able to cross. We also think about accessibility. You talked about, that visual part of art, but we also have a large section of our community who, may have visual impairment or may not be able to interact with the art on that level. So how do we provide experiences for them where that section of our nation and our community are still able to access their national collection and the stories and the soul that this collection embodies, right? We are very intentional about our accessibility landscape, as it were. So we try to offer tours in different languages, and I know they also do this at the National Museum as well, including audio guides, using QR codes, ensuring that the physical space is accessible for people in wheelchairs or for individuals with various disabilities. ensuring that we have touch points in education as well. So whether that's a basket of objects that people can use that are more material and tactile, because we're aware that we have learners who learn in many different ways, not just visually. So it's really about, again, that flexibility and being able to pivot your approach to a very, very diverse community.
Thank you. And Verily, perhaps you'd like to continue along these lines, because I think when we open the discussion about whether it needs to be physical space or virtual space, when in fact what we're talking about is accessibility of the art, which is the critical issue for many of our collections in the Caribbean. Do you have thoughts on this point?
Sure. And accessibility at different levels. And I think we're in a heritage structure which poses its own problems in terms of adapting it for physical accessibility. I mean, we have the same problem, there is no elevator and so on. So in terms of physical access, there definitely are boundaries. But there are many other issues of accessibility. And where I would challenge you a little bit is that visuality is very important.
Yes.
in museums, art, and others. But a museum really ought to appeal to all the senses,
Yes.
right? And even the oral and so on is very important. I mean, we're talking about a project of bringing some of the soundscapes of the natural environments in the Cayman Islands, the wetlands and so on, into the museum, so that there can also be that kind of experience. So I think access also needs to be at that level. We're also in dialogue with an organization called Inclusion Cayman, and they work primarily with people who are on the autism spectrum, but about having sensory experiences where the sensory experiences are actually reduced, so that another kind of experience of the museum can take place. So I think access it's a very broad spectrum kind of thing that we need to think about. Language is another. I mean, we have Maya mentioned our audio guides. We added to the conventional languages. We added Caymanian dialect. I think it's very important to include the Creole languages of the Caribbean in our remit. We added Jamaican Patois also, and Tagalog, because Jamaicans and Filipinos are the two largest expatriate groups, the two largest migrant groups in the Cayman Islands. So we just wanted to send a signal, basically, that everybody was welcome and included in the dialogues that we offer.
Thank you very much. And now I turn back to Jorge, and I have to ask Jorge, do you have a sense of whether the issue of credibility and permanence is the key point, or are we talking about accessibility, education, entertainment almost, engagement of the community? How do you perceive this to function through your institution?
Sí, eso que dices es clave, ¿no? Nosotros, por suerte, tenemos un departamento educativo que tiene la edad mía, 60 años.
What you're saying is very key. We have an education department which plays a crucial role.
Y ahora prácticamente la mayoría de los especialistas que tenemos ahí son jóvenes.
And nearly all of the specialists that we have there are young.
Y de diferentes formaciones.
And they're from different groups.
Vienen de la comunicación, de la pedagogía,
They work in communication, teaching,
de la historia del arte,
art history,
y tenemos graduados de arte también.
and we have also other areas.
Por lo tanto, los proyectos no pueden ser proyectos desde de simple planteamiento didáctico,
So the projects that we have are not simply educational. They can't just be educational.
sino cómo llegar a las diferentes comunidades.
That we need to be able to reach the different communities.
Los niños
Children.
que reciben enseñanza especial,
Children who receive special education,
los niños que están en la red de escuelas tradicionales,
children in traditional mainstream schools,
el adulto mayor,
older adults,
los adolescentes.
teens.
Hemos ido creando también un sistema de trabajo para los ciegos y los débiles los débiles visuales y también los sordos, ¿no?
We've been working on programs for the visually and hearing impaired.
Y cómo el museo también ha ido llegando al territorio donde está enclavado.
And we've been reaching the more remote areas of the country.
Estamos en el corazón de La Habana Vieja,
We're also in the heart of Old Havana,
donde hay problemas de vivienda, problemas sociales serios,
where there are housing problems and serious social problems.
y cómo el arte tiene esa posibilidad transformadora
And we were looking at the transformative capacity of art
de mejorar, de mejorar espiritualmente a la gente,
to improve people spiritually
de crear también una formación humanista profunda.
and to have a deep humanist training education.
Y así ha sido el trabajo que hemos desarrollado.
And this is the work we've been doing.
De hecho, inclusive muchos proyectos curatoriales y proyectos también vinculados propiamente a la labor de las exposiciones tienen que estar pensados desde las obras de los propios artistas, están pensados en función de la educación.
And many of the programs that we've been working on, we've had to work on them from the perspective of the artists.
Si pensamos que la educación está separada del arte, cometemos un gravísimo error.
If we think that education is separate from art, we're making a serious mistake.
El arte tiene que ser profundamente educativo.
Art must be deeply educational.
Y en ese sentido y sobre esa dinámica es que trabajamos.
And we have to work in that area.
Ahora mismo, recién terminé viniendo para acá, uno de los talleres nuestros estaba dedicado al títere, como expresión del teatro, a los títeres. Los títeres, ¿cómo se dice en inglés, Laurita? Es el teatro que son los muñecos que la gente crea que lo manipulas con las manos.
Oh, okay. So we've worked on a project with puppetry.
Y es súper interesante porque el títere, que parece una cosa que está alejado de las obras del teatro, se convierte del museo.
And it's interesting because puppetry, which is considered to be part of the area of the theater,
Se convirtió en un fenómeno creativo. Fue una manera en que los muchachos que participaron ahí dialogaron con las obras del museo.
it became a creative phenomenon because it allowed the young people who were involved to communicate, to express themselves.
Y nuestro departamento educacional ha pensado mucho en esa idea de sentir el arte. No mostrarlo, sino que la gente lo sienta.
And therefore, our Department of Education wanted to focus on feeling art rather than just seeing it.
Y a partir de las obras, los muchachos empezaron a expresar sus títeres a partir de historias personales que conectaban con las obras del museo.
And based on that experience, the young people started to connect the puppetry with their own experiences that they had and their own perception of the museum.
Y fue una experiencia profundamente conmovedora.
And it was a very moving
Creo que
experience.
fue una catarsis colectiva
And I think it was like a collective
y una
transformative
manera de descubrirse a ellos mismos.
and it helped us to discover our own selves.
Y los resultados siempre los terminan en exposición que pueden, y les damos el mismo valor, la misma importancia que la exposición de cualquier artista de relevancia en el museo.
And we want to give that kind of activity the same importance, the same relevance as any other activities that we will be
Y
doing.
esa
in the
tiene que
museum.
ser la experiencia. Para nosotros es una prioridad dentro del museo.
And this has to be our experience as a national entity.
I'm grateful to you for bringing in the notion of puppetry and, in a sense, really the notion of performance as a foundational and educative experience within the context of the National Museum. I want to tell you, I have to confess, I'm being a little bit unfair to you all because each of the speakers did in fact prepare wonderful PowerPoint exhibitions showing art. But I wanted to hear their voices, so excuse me for continuing the conversation. I wanted to talk a little bit about collections, representation, and identity, and Vera, I'm coming to you first. And to ask, how should national galleries balance showcasing national art with recognized broader Caribbean and diasporic connections? And how can national galleries counter exoticization and simplistic narratives of the Caribbean and instead present more complex and authentic perspectives. So over to you, Zelle.
Well, I always think that museums, art galleries, and so on need to ask questions rather than to provide answers, right? And I think leaving and that very important notion of the danger of a single narrative, I think that is something that really needs to be at the center of what we do. I mean, how can we open the conversation about national identity and so on rather than to close it off, right? I mean, how can we add to it? How can we add new voices to it? Because one of the issues, for instance, that I work with a lot of Generation Z staff members. Well, it's a very small staff, so perhaps I shouldn't use the term a lot, but my staff is mostly Generation Z. They have very different conceptions of identity than the generation that is dominant in museum management, So it's very important to bring their perceptions of who they are and what they stand for into the picture, So it is really, I think, the main thing with identity is that it always needs to be seen as a dynamic, open-ended, conflicted kind of thing. And I think one of the roles of a museum art gallery is really to be a forum for those kind of dialogues to take place. Right? So I hope that answers it.
I think that does a good job of bringing it into focus. Jorge, what are your thoughts in terms of this? How can national galleries counter exoticization? And exoticization, how can they counter it? Exoticization and simplistic narratives of the Caribbean, which can be a hazard for many of us in the Caribbean. We are invited into various dialogues and various exhibitions and projects, but often it's looking at through a very specific lens. How can the National Museum counter those kinds of situations and ensure that we have more authentic Caribbean perspectives being grounded in the kind of work that we do?
Es una pregunta compleja de responder.
It's a very complex question.
Pero te lo digo por el propio Museo Nacional de Bellas Artes en Cuba.
The community of the Museum of Fine Arts in Cuba
Es que surgió en 1913
was established in 1913,
y nuestros coleccionistas
and our collectors
estaban mirando mucho a Europa, ¿no?
were looking very much to Europe.
Y las colecciones que hay, bueno, tenemos en arte internacional. Realmente el edificio se llama Arte Universal.
And the building that houses the international collection is called the Universal Building.
Esto va a ser un debate con los curadores. Aquí está la jefa del departamento de curaduría.
And this has been a debate that we've had with the curators.
Seguirle llamando Arte Universal me parece un problema.
Because for me, it's problematic to continue calling it a universal.
Como decía Enrique Dussel, ¿no? Lo universal es lo único, ¿no? La mirada de Europa. Realmente yo decía Dussel, es mejor hablar de lo pluriversal.
For me, it would be better to talk about the pluriversal perspective rather than universal perspective.
Y hacer una mirada pluriversal.
We need to have a pluriversal perspective.
Y todo esto yo creo que hay que generar un pensamiento desde nuestra región.
And we need to bring in our own perspective.
Y el museo nuestro todavía, en sus colecciones internacionales, tiene una puesta en escena profundamente colonizadora, ¿no? Nuestro museo, en nuestras colecciones internacionales, hay todavía una puesta en escena colonizadora, ¿no?
And we've had a bit of a colonizing slant in our international museum. In our
¿Cómo
exhibitions.
replantearte todo eso es el gran desafío?
How do we reframe that? That's a major challenge.
De hecho, bueno, para mí fue muy importante haber pasado por la Bienal de La Habana primero.
And for me, it was important to look at Havana first
Porque
of all.
soy profesor del Art Institute en Cuba,
Because I'm a teacher, a professor at the Institute in Cuba.
pero prácticamente la asignatura que yo doy se basa en el arte occidental.
But the subject I'm teaching is focused on Western
Porque
art.
después está gente que da arte africano, arte asiático, arte del Caribe.
And we've integrated African, Caribbean art,
Entonces,
Asian
arte
art.
latinoamericano. Es simpático porque colegas, profesoras, amigos míos, cuando yo pongo un ejemplo de un artista del Caribe en mi clase, como pongo a Helio Itichica o a Helio Itichica, cuando pongo un ejemplo de un artista latinoamericano,
When I give the example of a Latin American artist,
o en mi clase me dice la profesora, esta colega amiga, oye, estás poniendo artistas latinoamericanos y lo tuyo es el arte occidental.
and my
Ya me
colleague,
dijeron los muchachos que le pusiste una película de Helio Itichica. Es como que esa manera de enseñar el arte compartimentado, ¿no?
we have this tendency to look at art in a compartmentalized way.
Entonces, es la gran, hay que establecer una ruptura con esas cosas.
We need to break away from that.
De hecho, inclusive, en la última Bienal de La Habana, ya yo mirando la Bienal desde el museo y no dirigiendo la Bienal, hicimos una exposición de artistas, mujeres caribeñas. Pero es la primera vez que el Museo Nacional de Bellas Artes de Cuba hace una exposición dedicada al Caribe. La primera vez. Increíble.
We had a museum focused on women artists, but it was the first time that we actually focused on Caribbean artists.
Bueno, aquí está Annalise Davis,
And Alice David,
que estuvo aquí, está por aquí,
oh, okay.
que estuvo en la primera Bienal que yo participé en el 2009 y estuvo en esta exposición del museo.
And he participated, or she participated in the
Pero además,
exhibition in 2009.
Yo no tengo el dinero que tenía la burguesía cubana antes de la revolución, pero le pedí a Annalise que si no puede donar la obra, ahora tengo que negociarlo con ella, para tener en la colección nuestra artistas del Caribe, que no tenemos tampoco.
I don't have the same funding that we would have had before the revolution, but I'm thankful to her,
Annalie Davis.
Annalise Davis, for the contributions that she's brought.
Y nada, esa es una carencia que tenemos.
And that is one of the gaps that we have.
Entonces, como nosotros, inclusive cuando entré en la Bienal de La Habana, hasta los artistas cubanos contemporáneos, a veces el arte que se produce en el Caribe, como no es el arte de las grandes superproducciones, como no aparece en las enciclopedias de Art Now, le parece que le falta algo a ese arte.
And when we started looking at these West Indian artists, there was this perception, this incorrect perception that we were missing something.
Y para mí la Bienal de La Habana fue una revelación, ¿no? Fue reencontrarme con el arte del Caribe, con el arte de Latinoamérica.
And that experience enabled me to re-encounter the West Indian art, Caribbean art.
Ahora es el desafío ahora es como tú desmontas una obra de Canaletto, de Lucas Cranes o la colección completa de España con los Sorolla para poner arte latinoamericano y del Caribe, ¿no?
And that's the challenge when we want to bring in Latin American art and art from the Caribbean. That's the difficulty.
Pero habrá que crear un espacio para eso. Y habrá que ver cómo nosotros podemos estimular a través de donaciones, de colaboraciones. No tenemos grandes boards que financian, ni existe una política empresarial, fiscal en Cuba que permita que la gente done obras al museo.
We have limited resources, and we don't have a big board that can enable us to reach out and get all the financing that we would really need.
Pero estamos necesitados de tener Latinoamérica, Caribe y África.
But we need to collaborate with the Caribbean, Latin America, and Africa.
Porque es un museo, como lo verán aquí, tiene 7 escuelas europeas
As you
de
can,
primerísimo nivel.
we have 7 European schools that are top notch.
Tiene también arte latinoamericano. Quizás la colección más completa de como país latinoamericano es México.
And perhaps the Latin American country that has the best collection is Mexico.
Hicimos una exposición recientemente de 400 años de arte mexicano.
We did an exhibition of 400 years of Mexican art recently,
Todo el mundo se quedó impresionado por la
and
obra.
everybody was blown away by that
Pero en
exhibition.
el resto de los países falta.
But the rest of the countries,
Y
there's a
nosotros que
lot.
venimos, porque no hubiera asistido Wilfredo Lang, que es nuestro gran artista, si no se hubieran desarrollado conceptos como lo afrocaribeño. Si Lang no hubiera estado en Haití, si Lang no hubiera pasado por Martinica, si Lang no hubiera llegado a Dominicana, hubiera sido imposible hacer la serie donde fue más original.
We had the participation of Martinique, of other Caribbean countries, and that was phenomenal. That enabled us to achieve a lot.
Lang siempre decía, alguien le dijo, bueno, pero es que Picasso llegó a la máscara africana antes que usted.
And we had to say that Picasso actually reached the African mask. He explored that before us.
Pero Lan contestó, el problema es que Picasso tuvo que salir a buscar a África. La diferencia es que África estaba en mí.
The challenge was that Picasso had to go for Africa, but for us, Africa is within us.
Pero así todo, todavía la obra europea, de la estancia europea de Lan, está muy conectada con Picasso.
And European artwork is very closely linked to Picasso.
Inclusive aquí se puso la jungla. Todavía la jungla de Lan se puso aquí.
We also saw the jungle, the painting about the jungle.
Todavía me resulta muy picasiana.
It seems very Picassan to me.
Para mí la ruptura de Lan está en Canaima
And the structure of it, you can see it there.
y está en Huracán.
And you can see it in Hurricane,
Lo que es el 45 y el 46.
which is 45 and
Y
47.
es súper interesante cuando Pierre Maville lo invita a Haití y su estancia en Haití.
And it was very interesting to see that when they were invited to Haiti,
Cambió la figuración por completo.
it changed the configuration
Fue como lo
totally.
dijo Lee Carney a Jackson Polo, ahora sí eres Polo, ¿no? Cuando empezó a chorrear los drippers. Y aquí, cuando Lan llega a Haití y llega a Martinica y empieza a hacer todo lo que hace después, había que decir, ahora sí eres Wilfredo Lan, ya no eres Picasso.
And when he moved from Martinique to Haiti and the other territories, we could see his work coming out then.
Bueno, me entiendo mucho siempre responder.
Thank you very
Disculpe.
much for this.
Thank you very much, Jorge, for that. What would I call it? Peregrination across many different themes that interweave the way in which our institutions have become and are becoming in the future. But I want now to turn finally to you, Maya, to have your take on how are these conversations evolving? What are our thoughts in the way in which we can positively recognize the role of the visual arts in the development of national or regional identities, and to really and to recognize first and foremost that when we talk about a museum or a gallery, we're talking about, for the Caribbean, we're talking about a Western construction of a particular form of presenting heritage, history, culture. And how can our Caribbean institutions move away from that, as he has represented it? How can we do that?
Well, I think we mentioned that sort of concept of the museum as a repository before. And what we're really trying to do at the National Gallery of the Cayman Islands is to move away from that concept, that sort of European concept of this beautiful building in which all of these old things are housed. Because it does feel quite static, and often it comes with a lot of very challenging and traumatic histories. At our gallery, I think what we're looking at is exploring how our own culture can express itself. So, for example, the rich storytelling cultures of the Caribbean. How can we, as Rella said, bring in this concept of the oral as well? How can we reinvent what we're doing to move away from this concept of just a physical building with items inside it to a living, breathing, constantly changing and moving space in which the community can express itself. And I think to feed into your previous question as well, I think these are connected ideas because it's also about diversifying voices and diversifying experiences. We have really made an effort to have committees, for example. So we're constantly checking ourselves. Is the staff of the museum the ones making all the decisions about what happens in the museum? It shouldn't necessarily be that way, right? We should be receiving feedback from our communities of what they want to see, whether that's through focus groups, whether it's through having those formal committees like a collections committee, to ensure that we're being ethical in our decision making and representing all of these diverse voices that we have in our community, and ensuring that continues for the future. Again, switching up our approach when the approach needs to be switched up. Culture is constantly changing, and we have to respond to that. So yeah, I think it's really in this programmatic model, which goes back to the roots of what the Cayman Islands National Gallery is, right?
Thank you very much, Maya. I think it was important to have these conversations, and particularly to recognize, as indeed, Veli, you mentioned, that when we talk about these spaces and these institutions, we are not just talking about the visual, but we're talking about the performative and the oral. These are key components that we have to keep in mind as we build and develop and evolve our institutions, and should they be institutions, as opposed to spaces, community-based spaces, you know, how would you respond
If
to
I
that?
could add just something to that, I think it's also about when you say community spaces, there's a lot of programs that we run that are maybe feel disconnected from visual art. So for example, we have a wellness program, which is really about, again, facilitating a community space and allowing the whole public to come into the space and utilize the museum. So whether that's a yoga class on the lawn or it's nutrition classes, we do an open mic poetry night, which really speaks to the way that visual arts and these oral cultures inform each other. So nothing is really in silo. Everything's interconnected.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to give the last part of our session over to each of the members of the panel to say a few words. Is there anything you would particularly like to convey or has particularly raised its head for you in terms of our conversation today and in terms of the way in which we should be looking at the evolution of these spaces? Evolution, revolution, whatever. Veli.
Thank you. There's sort of two things that have been on my mind during this conversation, and sort of to bring it back to the National Gallery conversation. You just asked about models, and why is the Caribbean, or at least the Anglophone Caribbean, so wedded to this idea of a National Gallery? Right? Is it just a name, or does there come, what kind of baggage comes with that concept, and why is it deemed so important? Not knocking the National Galleries. I think they have been transformative presences in the various contexts in which they have operated, even though sometimes they're also quite contentious in many ways, and in terms of, you know, the way they are positioned in the critical dialogues. So I think we need to probably have another conversation about those models and really how they can be translated into something that is really more culturally appropriate and relevant. But the second thing I wanted to put on the table, which I didn't respond to with regards to your question of exoticism, the elephant in the room for many of us is tourism, right? I mean, how do we engage with tourism? How does tourism dialogue with the idea of national identity dialogues within the Caribbean? How do those two coexist, right? We are located steps away from the cruise ship terminal. I would say probably easily 75% of our visitors are cruise ship tourists. What does that mean to a museum such as ours, which is so connected to this idea of a Caymanian identity? You know, so I think that's another kind of conversation that really needs to be had more actively.
Jorge, have you any final words that you'd like to share, or thoughts or ideas that have emerged as a result of this conversation, or that you'd like to make sure you put on the table before we close?
No, es que los contextos en que estamos nosotros situados, no sé, a veces es difícil porque es más fácil para cualquier cubano, tú dices, ir a España, ir a Madrid o ir a Europa que llegar a Barbados.
We're in a very challenging context because it's easier for a Cuban to go to Europe than it is to come to the Caribbean.
Todavía no hemos podido resolver quizás eso que decía Edward Camao, de las conexiones submarinas.
We haven't been able to deal with the underground, undersea connections.
Entonces todavía falta de verdad entender cómo se producen esas conexiones submarinas.
So we need to figure out how we can make those connections possible.
Ahora mismo la delegación cubana que vino al CARIFESTA
Right now, the Cuban delegation to CARIFESTA
ha sido tremendo para poder llegar aquí. Ha habido que pasar por una cantidad de lugares,
had a hard time getting here. We had to go through a number of places,
como si estuviéramos viajando a Japón o a China.
as if we were going to Japan or China.
Entonces, lo primero es cómo creamos esas conexiones.
So the first thing is to create those crucial connections.
Estamos tan distantes y a la vez hay tantas raíces culturales que nos unen, pero es una cosa, es como una maldición que no nos deja que nos integremos verdaderamente.
We have roots that we share, but we also need to overcome those obstacles that are facing us.
Nuestras exposiciones no itineran. A veces para si podemos hacer una encuesta a los estudiantes de arte en Cuba, hay que ver cuántos artistas europeos conocen y cuántos artistas del Caribe saben quiénes son.
It would be interesting to do a survey among our students to find out how many European
Y así lo podemos
artists they know and how
hacer.
many Caribbean
Podemos
artists.
hacer una encuesta ya no solo entre el público general, sino entre los que estudian arte.
And we also need to do a survey among the public
¿Cuáles
in
son sus
general.
artistas fetiches? ¿Cuáles son sus artistas de referencia?
Who are your favorite artists?
Habría que crear un museo itinerante del Caribe,
We need to have an itinerant museum in the Caribbean
donde nos conectemos todos.
where we can connect with each other.
Es difícil,
It's a
pero
challenge,
nada es imposible.
but nothing is impossible.
I want to thank you very much, Jorge, for putting back on the table an idea that had been born in 1983 about a mobile museum of the Caribbean. We need to think about that. Maya, any last thoughts or words you'd like to share with us?
Well, actually, what Jorge reminded me of was a story that my dad told me from when he was a child, which is quite interesting. His teacher put two quotes up, two pieces of writing up on the board, and one was, blah, 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 Derek Walcott, and then blah, 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 William Shakespeare. And he said, okay, I want you to critique these pieces of writing. And they tore up the Derek Walcott piece. This is terrible writing. It's, the imagery is da 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 da. And they just lavished praise on the William Shakespeare one. And at the end of the exercise, his teacher then swapped the titles. And it was a really great example of how this perception of these European names is informing how we see ourselves in a way. So I think one of the roles that national institutions can also play is to help us challenge our own perceptions of who we are and challenge pervasive narratives about our country and our experiences in our various contexts. And hopefully we can, as Verla said, provide a platform for these dialogues and conversations that challenge our own notions of ourselves.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maya. Thank you very much, team. I want to ask on behalf of us all if we could give a round of applause to our three guests, Jorge, Maya, and Verla. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for being with us, for engaging in this conversation with us, and we look forward to continuing the dialogue on many different levels. And now I'd like to turn the floor back over to Clyde to introduce the third and final panel. Thank you very much, Jorge.
Thank you very much. We will have a few minutes longer than we had last time in transition. One of our panelists is joining us virtually. And also I've been told by the people who are streaming this on the